Welcome to Starbound. My name is the Voice Ogre. I'll be your narrator today. But before we get started with the video, let me ask to see if you're subscribed real quick. If you're not, it's fine, but it's free, and it will let you know whenever we post new videos. Thank you. The private shuttle descended through wisps of rose-gold clouds, giving Brock Hansen his first glimpse of the Sunspire Academy, the most prestigious school in the galaxy. Though he wondered why it was in the singular. Sprawling spires of copper and bronze stretched towards the sky, their surfaces catching the light of the system's ancient star and setting the entire cityscape ablaze in a metric brilliance. The sight might have taken his breath away if he wasn't so determined to hate everything about it. "Your residence is located in the western quarter, young master," the pilot announced in carefully practiced English. "Should I arrange for a guide to escort you to your first class?" "No thanks." Brock ran a hand through his brown hair, deliberately messing up the careful styling his father's servants had insisted on. "I got the nav system." The shuttle touched down on one of the countless landing pads dotting the university grounds. As the door slid open, Brock caught snippets of conversation in dozens of languages, all being simultaneously translated by the small device in his ear. Most of them seemed to be about him.
"Is that really the human student? Gabriel Hansen's son?"
Brock stepped out into the artificial sunlight, his boots clicking against the metal platform. The temperature was perfect, the gravity exactly Earth normal, and even the air had been carefully filtered to remove any trace of the native atmosphere. My father's influence at work, no doubt. The thought made his jaw clench. The gathered crowd of students gave him a wide berth as he strode past. Some of them were Aryans, their metallic skin glinting with complex facial patterns that marked their age and status. Others were blue-skinned Tripians, who moved with an almost artificial grace, or hulking gourds, whose pale forms towered over their peers. Still, others belonged to species Brock couldn't even begin to identify, despite the crash course in xenobiology he'd been forced to take before arrival. He pulled up the campus map on his personal device, deliberately ignoring the countless eyes following his movement. The Sunspire might cover all of a small planet, but finding his first class wasn't exactly rocket science. Although, given where he was, that would probably be covered in the afternoon lesson. Human history. Of course, that would be his first class. He'd chosen it partly because it was one of the few courses still accepting transfers this late in the term, but mostly because he figured he would coast through it. After all, how hard could it be to learn about your own species? The classroom itself was housed in one of the smaller spires, though small was relative when discussing architecture that would dwarf most Earth skyscrapers. Brock paused in the doorway, taking in the tiered rows of seats filled with an assortment of alien students. A gangly wolf-like creature hunched over a datapad in the front row, while a particularly massive gourd occupied most of a bench in the back. One of the Aryan students stood, mouth opening to speak, but whatever they planned to say was cut off by the arrival of the professor. The entire class fell silent as Professor Oubliette entered, his gold skin almost entirely covered by intricate swirling patterns that spoke of considerable age and status. The simple, practical cut of his clothing stood in stark contrast to the ornate markings on his face. Brock slipped into an empty seat, already mapping out how he'd spend the rest of his enforced exile at this prestigious institution. The professor began arranging his materials with methodical precision, and Brock couldn't help but notice how even that simple action drew the rapt attention of every other student in the room. Well, almost every student. The gourd in the back was openly staring at Brock, pale eyes narrowed in what might have been curiosity or challenge. Brock met his gaze evenly, one corner of his mouth quirking up with a slight smile. If the brute was looking to establish dominance, he'd picked the wrong human to intimidate. "Welcome, class." Professor Oubliette's voice carried easily through the room. "Today, we begin our exploration of humanity's brief but remarkable history. And it seems we are fortunate enough to have a primary source joining us." All eyes turned to Brock, though he noticed the gourd in the back was already watching him with an unsettling intensity. There was something predatory in those pale eyes, all four of them, that spoke of barely contained aggression. "Mr. Hansen," Professor Oubliette gestured to the front of the room. "Perhaps you would be willing to introduce yourself to the class?" Brock considered refusing, but decided against it. No point in antagonizing the professor on day one. He rose and made his way down to the presentation area, aware of the mix of curiosity and apprehension in the gathered students' expressions. "Name's Brock Hansen. he turned to face the class, hands casually tucked into his pockets. From Earth, obviously. Probably the only student here who didn't actually apply to attend. A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the room. The wolf-like student in the front row, some species from the Porthian Combine, Brock guessed, looked up from his datapad for the first time, brown eyes studying Brock with unexpected intensity behind thick-rimmed glasses. "You didn't apply?" Professor Oubliette's face shifted to a curious look, causing the patterns on his skin to appear as if they move and shift. "Yet, you were accepted to the most prestigious university in known space?" "My father decided it'd be good for me," Brock shrugged. "Something about the historic significance of being the first human student here. I'm pretty sure he just wanted me out of the way for a while." More murmurs, these tinged with shock at his casual dismissal of such an honor. In the back, the Gord's nasal openings flared as he let out what might have been a snort of derision. The movement drew Brock's attention to the crude, heavily armored clothing the alien wore, a kind that skirted the edge of what was legally permitted on the campus. "I'm sure there's quite a story there," Professor Oubliette said diplomatically. "But perhaps we should begin with our scheduled material. Please, take your seat, Mr. Henson." Brock returned to his spot, noting how the other students shifted slightly away from him. Whether it was his species or his attitude that made them uncomfortable, he couldn't tell. The wolf student was still watching him, head slightly tilted in what might have been curiosity. A few rows back, an Orion student with particularly intricate copper tone patterns leaned forward to whisper to their neighbor. "Can you believe the arrogance? Even for a Deathworlder." "At least the Gords admit what they are," came the whispered reply. "This one acts like he's at some pleasure resort." Brock pretended not to hear, though he filed away the term Deathworlder for future reference. He'd encountered it in his preparatory materials, but he hadn't realized it was a common designation for humans. The fact that they lumped his species in with the Gords was interesting, if not particularly flattering given his limited exposure to their culture so far. The professor activated the room's holographic display, filling the air with a timeline of human history. The projection cast everything in a soft blue glow that made the metallic skin of the Orion students shimmer and caught the edges of the Gord's armored clothing in sharp relief. "Today, we begin our exploration of humanity's development as a spacefaring species," Professor Oubliette began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "But to understand their remarkable journey to the stars, we must first understand their equally remarkable capacity for conflict." Brock settled back in his seat, wondering just how much these aliens thought they knew about humanity's capacity for anything. Behind him, he could hear the Gord shifting restlessly, the movement accompanied by a soft scraping sound that suggested those crude armor plates weren't just for show. Professor Oubliette began with prehistory, and Brock found his attention wandering to the view outside. Through the crystalline windows of the spire, he could see vessels of various sizes moving through designated flight lanes between the towering structures. Somewhere out there was his private dorm, another gift from his father that felt more like a cage than a comfort. The familiar ache of homesickness twisted in his gut. Right now, his friends back on Earth would be starting their first semester at regular colleges. Jake would be rushing that fraternity they'd talked about all through senior year. Sarah would be pursuing her dreams in art school. Meanwhile, he was stuck here, forced to be a historic first just because his father thought it would look good for the company. The agricultural revolution marked humanity's first major societal shift, Professor Oubliette continued, his simple attire contrasting sharply with the ornate historical imagery floating above the class. Unlike many species who developed agriculture through careful observation and experimentation, humans essentially stumbled into it through trial and error. Brock suppressed a smile as several students frantically recorded this detail. If they thought that was interesting, wait till they learned about how humans discovered which mushrooms were edible. Though, given how his fellow students had reacted to him so far, maybe that particular detail would do more harm than good to humanity's reputation. The wolf student in the front row hadn't taken a single note, Brock noticed. Instead, he seemed to be working on complex mathematical formulas that had nothing to do with the lecture. Yet every time the professor posed a question to the class, those eyes behind the thick glasses would dart up, and a quiet but perfectly accurate answer would follow. A sharp scraping sound drew Brock's attention back to the Gord, who seemed incapable of sitting still in his armored outfit. The pale alien's aggressive posture reminded Brock of the bullies he'd dealt with back home, all bluster and intimidation, usually hiding deep insecurity. Maybe some things really were universal. Of course, the development of bronzeworking led to significant changes in human warfare, the professor continued, his patterns glinting in the sunlight through the window as he paced. Though perhaps not as dramatic as many species experienced. The lecture continued, and Brock found himself plotting out his approach to university life. Sure, he hadn't wanted to come here, but he was stuck here for at least a year. Might as well make the best of it. Build a reputation as someone approachable but not soft. Knowledgeable but not arrogant. Balance the whole Deathworlder thing they seem so fixated on with enough charm to avoid being feared. Beyond the windows, the sun of Arius II cast its golden light across the sprawling campus. Somewhere in those countless spires, other classes were in session, covering everything from quantum mechanics to xenobiology. The sheer scale of knowledge contained within this institution was humbling, even if Brock would never admit that out loud. The holographic display shifted again, moving into more recent history. The professor began discussing the rapid technological advancement humans had shown in developing weapons of war, and Brock's attention snapped back to the lecture. Something about the images being displayed seemed wrong. Professor Oubliette manipulated the holographic controls with practiced ease, zooming in on specific segments of the timeline. Human history is marked by near-constant conflict, a trait they share with the Gordic Empire. However, unlike the Gords, whose warfare is deeply ritualistic, human conflicts often arose from complex sociopolitical factors. The professor's voice and eyes were both alight with enthusiasm as he spoke. Their weapons technology evolved rapidly, from simple projectile weapons to increasingly sophisticated variants. The hologram shifted to display various human weapons throughout history. Brock found himself leaning forward despite his earlier disinterest. Something about the images seemed off. This example, the professor indicated what appeared to be an assault rifle, is particularly interesting. The AK-47, humanity's most produced weapon. Designed for reliability over accuracy, it exemplifies their pragmatic approach to warfare. Except that wasn't an AK-47. Brock frowned at the image, recognizing the distinctive carrying handle and sight assembly of an M16. Before he could stop himself, his hand was in the air. The wolf student's ears twitched at the movement, his glasses glinting as he turned to look at Brock. In the back of the room, the Gord's spines bristled with what might have been anticipation or disruption. Yes, Mr. Hansen? Professor Oubliette raised a single brow, the patterns upon it shifting up in much the same way a normal eyebrow would. You have something to add? Actually, Professor, that's not an AK-47, it's an M16. Probably an A1 variant given the length of the flash hider. The AK has a more distinctive profile, a curved magazine, gas block above the barrel, and that sort of thing. The room fell silent. Even the perpetual scratching of data pads ceased as every student turned to stare at him. The professor's head ticked down slightly, and his cheeks shifted in a way that caused his facial patterns to brighten slightly as blood flowed. Brock had read that this was, among Aryans, considered a sign of intense interest. Fascinating. Professor Oubliette adjusted the display. And this one? Another example of early projectile weapons? The image changed to show what the professor clearly thought was a different rifle. Brock couldn't help but smile. That's also an M16. It's just the A2 variant. You see the adjustable rear sight and the round handguards? Well, the A1 had triangular ones. A low growl emanated from the back of the room as the Gord leaned forward, the movement causing his armor plates to scrape against each other. You seem to know much about killing human. The way he said human made it sound like an insult. Several students tensed at the aggression in his tone, but Brock kept his response casual. And they're just tools, like anything else. Known for their reliability and ease of maintenance. The M16 platform is actually pretty famous for
Tools of death,
the Gord interrupted, his four eyes narrowing.
yet you speak of them like toys.
The wolf student had fully turned in his seat now, his attention darting between Brock and the Gord with analytical intensity. Other students were shifting uncomfortably, clearly unused to such confrontational exchanges in their classes. Professor Oubliette's expression was becoming progressively more difficult to read, as his emotions made him gesticulate more vibrantly. Perhaps, Mr. Hansen, you could explain how you came by such detailed knowledge. Are you perhaps from a military family?
Not exactly.
Brock considered his next words carefully, aware that he was already developing a reputation. But there was no point in hiding it. They'd find out eventually.
I just enjoy sports shooting. It's a hobby.
The resulting silence was deafening. Someone's datapad clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly still classroom. Even the Gord seemed taken aback, his aggressive posture shifting to something more akin to confusion. Professor Oubliette's facial pattern were practically dancing as his mouth rapidly ran and head movements became erratic. It seems when he's excited, he just can't hold himself still. A hobby, you say? Would you be willing to elaborate on this? Recreational use of weapons. The professor's enthusiasm was infectious, spreading through the classroom despite, or perhaps because of, the lingering shock. Even the Gord's aggressive posture had shifted to something more akin to genuine curiosity, his spine settling back into their relaxed position. A demonstration would be invaluable, Professor Oubliette said, his eyes filled with academic excitement. Though I understand if you would prefer not to.
I got my gear back at my dorm,
Brock interrupted, warming up to the idea despite his initial reluctance. Maybe this was the perfect opportunity to show them that humans weren't just violent Deathworlders. And a proper range setup. Father insisted on it. Probably the one thing that we agreed on. The wolf student's ears perked up at this, his first obvious display of interest in the proceedings.
Your private residence has a dedicated firing range?
He asked, voice quiet but clear. Among other things. Brock nodded.
The whole facility's pretty well equipped.
Whispers rippled through the classroom as this casual mention of private accommodations. Most students, even those from wealthy families, lived in the standard dormitory spires. Private residences were typically reserved for visiting dignitaries or senior faculty. Your father must be quite influential, one of the Orion students observed. Their copper-tone patterns held an almost envious shade of green. Though surely that was a coincidence. Brock shrugged.
He likes to throw money at things. It makes him feel important.
The professor quickly seized control of the situation before the discussion could derail further. If you're willing to demonstrate your hobby, I believe this would make an excellent practical lesson. The shuttle bay is just 2 levels down. The class moved with barely contained excitement. Data pads clutched close as they filed out of the room. The Gord lingered near the back, his pale eyes fixed on Brock with an unreadable expression. The shuttle bay turned out to be more like a small starport, with vessels of various sizes arranged in neat rows. Their assigned transport was a sleek passenger model, its interior arranged in tiered seating reminiscent of the classroom. How far is your residence, Mr. Hansen? Professor Oubliette asked as the class boarded.
It's about 20 minutes by shuttle,
Brock replied, settling into a seat near the front.
It's in the western quarter, near the atmospheric processing complex.
The wolf student, who had somehow ended up in the seat beside him, looked up from his datapad.
The premium resident district,
he muttered, more to himself than anyone else.
Interesting.
The shuttle lifted off smoothly, joining one of the designated flight lanes that wove between the massive spires. From this height, the true scale of the university became apparent. Buildings stretched to the horizon in every direction, their copper and bronze surfaces creating a metallic forest that sparkled in the sunlight.
Is it true that humans consider projectile weapons entertaining?
The Trepian student a few rows back asked, their blue skin almost luminescent in the filtered sunlight streaming through the shuttle's windows.
Some of us do,
Brock answered carefully.
It's about skill and precision more than anything else.
Like any sport.
Sport,
the Gord repeated from his position at the rear of the shuttle, the word coming out like a challenge. His armor pressed against and slightly dented the seat as he leaned forward.
You play with weapons of war for amusement.
We turn lots of things into sports, Brock said, keeping his tone casual. Martial arts, archery, even throwing heavy objects for distance. Humans like to compete. The professor spoke as if hypnotized, absorbing new information with all the focus of a dedicated academic. Fascinating. The recreational militarization of potentially lethal activities. This could explain much about human cultural development. The shuttle banked gently, descending toward a cluster of private residences that stood slightly apart from the main campus. Brock's temporary home was easily identifiable by the large landing pad and the subtle but effective security measures his father had insisted upon.
Fair warning,
Brock said as they approached.
The targeting system is pretty basic compared to what you're probably used to. We keep things old school in sports shooting. Not that any of you will be using them unless you brought your own. I doubt any of you are licensed for human firearms.
The private residence turned out to be a moderately sized dwelling by galactic standards, though it would have qualified as a mansion back on Earth. Brock led the group through a series of security checkpoints. each one scanning them with unobtrusive but thorough precision.
"The range is through here," he said, gesturing towards a sealed doorway. "But first, we gotta stop by the equipment room. Everyone needs proper ear protection."
"Ear protection?" the wolf student murmured, curiously tilting his head. Brock paid no mind. He figured the aliens just weren't used to bullets or something, especially if sport shooting is such a foreign concept to them. The equipment room was a testament to his father's thoroughness. Rows of protective gear lined the walls, each piece properly maintained and stored according to strict safety protocols. Brock began distributing hearing protection, taking care to find appropriate sizes for the various alien physiologies. "These were custom-made," the professor observed, examining one of the devices. "Your father anticipated visitors."
"He likes to be prepared,"
Brock replied, helping one of the Orion students adjust their protection.
"Although I doubt he expected the entire class to show up on day one."
The Gord stood near the back, regarding the protective gear with obvious skepticism. His pale skin seemed almost luminescent under the room's lighting, and his spines had taken on a slight bristle that suggested uncertainty rather than aggression.
"This seems excessive for simple sport,"
he rumbled, though he accepted the specially reinforced protection Brock offered him. Brock moved to a secure cabinet and pressed his hand against another scanner. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing his personal collection. He selected his favorite piece, a classic over-under shotgun that had been in the family for generations. The wood gleamed with careful maintenance, and the metal surfaces caught the light with mirror precision. The professor once again began his response with his favorite word. "Fascinating. Is this a common model amongst human sport shooters?"
"Common enough,"
Brock answered, checking the weapon with practiced ease. His movements were smooth and confident. He may not be a grizzled vet, but he'd been sport shooting since he was 12.
"It's traditional for clay shooting. Speaking of which..."
He pressed another control, and a section of the wall slid aside to reveal a rack of clay pigeons and the launching mechanism. Several students jumped at the movement, but the wolf student merely adjusted his glasses and leaned closer, studying the simple mechanical device with obvious interest.
"The launcher's automated,"
Brock explained, loading the magazine.
"The basic stuff, really. Springs and timing mechanisms."
"How primitive," one of the Orion students whispered, though they more so sounded intrigued than dismissive. Brock led them through another set of security doors and out onto the range proper. The space was open to the sky, but enclosed by energy fields that would contain any stray shots. A control panel near the firing position allowed for various launching patterns and speeds.
"Everyone stay behind the safety line,"
he instructed, indicating a clearly marked boundary.
"And make sure your hearing protection's secure. These things can get pretty loud."
The class arranged themselves with varying degrees of nervousness, all eyes fixed on the weapon in Brock's hands. The professor stood slightly apart as he recorded everything with his datapad.
"You ready for your first look at human sport shooting?"
Brock asked, settling into position. He couldn't help but grin at their mix of anticipation and apprehension. If they were this nervous about what they assumed were practice rounds, this was going to be interesting. Brock settled into his stance, the familiar weight of the shotgun comfortable against his shoulder. He'd done this thousands of times before. It's practically meditation at this point.
"Pull!"
he called out clearly. The launcher whirred to life, and the clay disc arced through the air on a perfect trajectory. Brock tracked it smoothly, his breathing steady as he led the target just so... Crack! The shot echoed across the range, and the clay disc shattered into a shower of fragments. For a moment, there was absolute silence, save for the tinkling of ceramic shards hitting the ground. Then, someone screamed. The class erupted into chaos. Several students scrambled backwards, nearly tripping over each other in their haste to get away. One of the Orion students actually fainted, their golden skin gone notably pale. The professor stood frozen, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and fascination.
"Those are live rounds!"
The Trepian student who had asked about entertainment earlier pressed themselves against the back wall, their blue skin taking on an almost ghostly pallor.
"He's firing actual ammunition!"
Brock lowered the shotgun immediately, making sure to keep it pointed downrange.
Wait, hold on. Did you think these were blanks or something?" "Of course we did!"
Another student called out from behind an equipment rack.
"What kind of educational institution allows live weapons?"
The wolf student hadn't moved from his position, though his ears were flat against his head and his tail completely rigid. His glasses had slipped down his nose, but he seemed too shocked to adjust them.
"No one uses live ammunition for sport,"
the Gord growled, though Brock noticed he hadn't retreated like the others. If anything, he'd stepped forward, his four eyes intense with... Was that respect?
Not even in the Empire.
But how else would you hit the clays? Brock asked, genuinely confused. You need the shot to spread to... He cut himself off, suddenly realizing just how many of his classmates were genuinely frightened. Look, this is completely normal on Earth. Sports shooting is regulated, sure, but it's just a hobby, like archery or fencing.
You consider weapons that can kill to be hobbies?
One of the students who had taken cover called out.
We consider lots of potentially dangerous things to be hobbies,
Brock explained, carefully engaging the safety and lowering the shotgun to a rest position.
Rock climbing, martial arts, racing vehicles. Humans enjoy testing ourselves against risk.
Professor Oubliette had finally recovered enough to step forward, though he maintained a respectful distance from the weapon. You mentioned this was common on Earth?
Sure. There's shooting ranges in most cities. Competition circuits, training programs, hunting clubs. It's a whole industry.
Probably millions of people participate worldwide. This revelation seemed to shock them almost as much as the gunshot had. The wolf student's ears had perked up slightly, his scientific curiosity apparently overcoming his initial fear.
Millions?
The professor's voice cracked slightly.
Participating in live fire exercises for entertainment?
Whoa, when you say it like that, it does sound weird,
Brock admitted. He gestured to the range.
But look, everything here is completely safe. The containment fields, the safety protocols, the proper equipment. Nobody gets hurt because we take the proper precautions.
The Gord moved closer, his pale skin seeming to gleam in the sunlight as he examined the shotgun with new interest.
Your people train with real weapons. For fun?
The tension in the air began to ease as the students realized Brock wasn't about to go on some kind of rampage. Several emerged from their hiding spots, though they maintained a healthy distance from both Brock and his weapon.
Perhaps,
Professor Oubliette ventured, his voice steady despite his lingering wariness. You could explain more about these safety protocols. Brock walked them through the basic rules of range safety, the certification process for sport shooters, and the various regulations that govern recreational shooting on Earth. With each detail, he could see more of his classmates relaxing, though none of them volunteered to try it themselves when he jokingly offered. The wolf student had produced his datapad again, fingers flying across its surface as he documented everything.
The psychological implications are fascinating, he muttered. A species that deliberately seeks out controlled danger for recreation. Waste of good ammunition, Bjorngir rumbled, his spines bristling. On my world, we hunt living prey, tests against cunning, not clay discs that fly in predictable paths.
Yeah? Try hitting one first, Brock challenged, unable to help himself. These trajectories might just be predictable, but that doesn't make them easy. The Gord's 4 eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, another student spoke up.
Do many humans participate in such aggressive recreation?
The Trapian asked, their blue skin still notably pale.
Or is this something unique to your social class?
It's pretty common among most levels of society, Brock explained. Though, yeah, having your own range is definitely a rich kid thing. Most people use public facilities. Professor Oubliette had regained his scholarly composure. This explains much about human integration into galactic society. Your species appears to have normalized activities that most civilizations reserve for military training.
Or ritual combat,
Bjorngir added, his pale skin catching the sunlight as he shifted his massive frame.
Though, at least those serve a purpose. This is mere entertainment.
The way he said it made it sound like an insult, but Brock could see the calculating look in those 4 eyes. The Gord was reassessing him, trying to square this new information with whatever preconceptions he'd held about humans.
I got a whole collection of competition medals back home,
Brock said casually, making sure to catch Bjorngir's gaze.
Turns out humans are pretty good at turning dangerous things into sports. We got this saying, practice makes perfect.
Several students tensed at what they clearly interpreted as a challenge, but Bjorngir's response was unexpected. He laughed, a deep, resonating sound that made his spines quiver.
So, the Deathworlder has fangs after all.
He rumbled.
But remember, human, some of us were born with ours.
The wolf student's ears twitched at this exchange, his eyes darting between them as he added more notes to his pad. The rest of the class seemed unsure whether to be more or less worried about this apparent understanding between the two Deathworlders. "Would you be willing to continue the demonstration?" Professor Oubliette had asked, his scholarly interest clearly overcoming any remaining apprehension. "This is precisely the kind of cultural insight our xenohistory studies require." Brock checked his ammunition supply and nodded. "Sure. Oh, fair warning, it only gets louder from here." Over the next hour, Brock demonstrated various shooting techniques, taking care to explain each step and safety measure. He kept his movements deliberate and his weapon pointed downrange, noting how the students' flinches grew less pronounced with each shot. "The spread pattern is determined by the choke," he explained, retrieving a fragment of clay to show the class. "See these marks? Each pellet leaves its own signature. In competition, judges can verify your hits by examining the break patterns." The wolf student had drawn closer, his scientific curiosity evidently overwhelming his earlier caution.
"The mathematics of the dispersion must be fascinating,"
he said, adjusting his glasses as he examined the fragment.
"Have you studied the aerodynamics involved?"
"Not really my thing," Brock admitted with an easy smile. "I just practice it until I get it right. But I got some technical manuals in the equipment room if you're interested." Several other students had gathered around to examine the fragment, their earlier fear replaced by academic interest. Even some of the Orions, who generally prided themselves on maintaining dignified distances, had joined the impromptu discussion.
"Your control is impressive,"
one of them noted, golden skin gleaming as they traced the pellet marks.
"Though I still question the wisdom of such activities."
"Hey, that's fair," Brock replied, carefully storing his weapon. "Definitely not for everyone. But neither is zero-G dancing or deep space freediving, and plenty of species do those." This earned him a few chuckles, and he could see several students nodding in agreement. The tension in the air had almost completely dissipated, replaced by the kind of casual academic discourse he'd expected from the galaxy's most prestigious university. From his position near the back of the group, Bjorngir watched the exchange with growing intensity. His pale skin seemed to take on an almost metallic sheen as his spines bristled with barely contained emotion.
"You make light of weapons,"
the Gord growled, cutting through the conversation.
"Play with them like toys, and they welcome you for it. But when I speak of true combat, of honorable battle, they recoil."
The other students shifted uncomfortably, several taking unconscious steps away from the massive alien. Brock noticed how their expressions changed, from the relaxed engagement of academic discourse to the wary distance he'd seen them display earlier. "Different cultures, different perspectives," Brock offered diplomatically. "Humans just happen to have found a middle ground between—"
"You are soft,"
Bjorngir interrupted, his armor plate scraping as he straightened to his full height.
"You dress up petty violence in pretty words and safety protocols. At least my people acknowledge what we are."
The wolf student's ears had flattened against his head again, but his eyes were sharp behind his glasses as they darted between the two Deathworlders. His datapad was forgotten in his hands, all pretense of academic documentation abandoned in the face of growing tension. But Brock just smiled and began packing away his equipment. "Maybe," he agreed easily. "Or maybe there's more than one way to be strong. Either way, I appreciate everyone coming out to learn about human culture. Even the parts that might seem strange at first." The casual dismissal seemed to throw Bjorngir more than any challenge could have. Several students visibly relaxed, and the professor seized the opportunity to begin herding everyone toward the shuttle. As they filed out, Brock caught fragments of conversation that made him hide a smile. "Did you see how careful he was with the safety protocols?"
"I suppose if it's properly regulated..."
"Really quite interesting from an academic perspective." Bjorngir lingered behind the group, his four eyes fixed on Brock with an unreadable expression. For a moment, it seemed he might say something more, but instead he turned sharply and stalked toward the shuttle, his armor creaking with each aggressive step. The wolf student was the last to leave, pausing at the door.
"Fascinating,"
he murmured, though whether he was referring to the shooting demonstration or the social dynamics that had played out, Brock couldn't tell. The next morning found Brock navigating the university's winding corridors with considerably less attention than he had the day before. The whispers still followed him, but their tone had shifted noticeably.
That goes the human. Did you hear about the demonstration? They say he's actually quite...
He was so busy pretending not to notice the attention that he almost missed the striking figure waiting by his classroom door. Almost, but not quite, and would have been difficult to overlook somebody who seemed to command the very light around them. The Trepian's sapphire skin caught the morning sun streaming through the windows, creating an almost ethereal glow. Her blazing orange hair cascaded in artistic waves that suggested hours of careful styling. And her outfit, something that looked like it belonged on a fashion runway rather than a classroom. It fit her curves with obvious custom precision.
"You must be Brock Hansen,"
she said, her voice carrying the practice melody of someone used to being listened to.
"I am L'Oreal Trinidad."
She said the name as if it should mean something to him. Given the way every other student in the corridor had stopped to watch this interaction, maybe it did. "Nice to meet you," Brock replied simply, moving to step around her towards the classroom door. Her perfect smile flickered for just a moment.
"I heard about your demonstration yesterday. How fascinating that humans have found a way to make art from warfare."
She stepped closer, her movement deliberately graceful.
"Perhaps you'd like to discuss it over at dinner? I know a lovely place in the upper spires."
"Thanks, but I already got plans," Brock said, not breaking stride as he entered the classroom. It wasn't even technically a lie. He did have plans. They just happened to involve ordering food to his dorm and calling his friends back on Earth. The silence that followed him into the room was absolute. Even the professor, already present and arranging his materials, seemed frozen in place. The wolf student's ears were standing straight up, his glasses slightly askew as he stared openly instead of pretending to study. L'Oreal stood in the doorway, her composed expression cracking just slightly around the edges.
"I don't think you understand,"
she said, her voice losing some of its musical quality.
"I am L'Oreal Trinidad."
"Yeah, you mentioned that," Brock replied, settling into his seat and pulling out his datapad. "Like I said, nice to meet you." A Trepian student near the back actually gasped. In the corridor beyond, dozens of faces peered in with expressions ranging from shock to horror to barely concealed delight. L'Oreal opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. For possibly the first time in her life, she seemed at a loss for words. Finally, she turned on her heel and strode away, her perfect posture radiating indignation with every step. As conversation slowly resumed around him, Brock caught a whispered exchange between two Aryan students.
"He just rejected the L'Oreal Trinidad?"
He really does have dangerous hobbies.
I hope you enjoyed that story. Click right here to watch another video with the same characters.